Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this wintertime management of poultry workshop. I'm Megan Ademeyer and I'm a conservation planner with the Clallam Conservation District. I've been working with the district for about 16 years now, and I do have poultry myself. However, my coworker Jennifer is actually going to be the one that is going to run through this workshop today. And just a couple of housekeeping things to start out with. We're going to try to keep everyone muted during the presentation. So if you are able to make sure you stay muted, that would be wonderful. We are recording this webinar so that we can share it with folks who weren't able to attend today. So it really helps to be able to keep the background noise down if we stay muted. If you have questions throughout the workshop, however, there's a little chat box up on the right-hand side. It kind of looks like a little bubble, and you can click on that, and then you can write your questions into the chat, and we'll address them twice during the workshop. Midway through, we're going to have a chance to stop and answer questions, and then at the very end, we'll answer questions as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to go ahead and get started. Jen, are you on there?
Great. Hi. Yes. Thanks, Megan. I am here. So let's see. Thanks for the introduction. I am a conservation planner with Clallam Conservation District. And like Megan, I've also kept a variety of poultry type, layers and broilers, and turkeys as well. I have not kept waterfowl, so I don't have a lot of personal experience with that, but we do have a slide later on in the presentation specific to waterfowl. So here's just a quick rundown of kind of laying out your screen to maximize the PowerPoint. If you click on the top button, change from view everyone to hide everyone, it will enable you to see the PowerPoint more full screen. As Megan mentioned, please make sure that you mute your mic and make sure your camera or your video is turned off. And yeah, feel free to ask questions as using the chat feature as we go through. And Megan's going to try to keep track of the questions, and then we will break partway through, like she mentioned, and talk a bit more about your specific questions. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So just for those of you who are not familiar with the Conservation District, conservation districts are nationwide grassroots organizations, and our mission is to protect and improve natural resources. So we work with a variety of landowners and land users throughout Clallam County. Pretty much every county in the country has a conservation district. They're called different things in different states. For example, Oregon is like a soil and water conservation district, but we are non-regulatory, so that does not mean that we cannot impose fines. We only work with folks on a voluntary basis, and there's a lot more information about who we are and what we do on our website. So I'd welcome you all to hop onto our website at some point and check that out. So poultry keeping in Clallam County, you know, a lot of times we have this kind of vision of what it will be like to keep chickens in this very nostalgic, collecting our eggs daily and just this like peaceful country activity. And oftentimes the reality of keeping chickens in Clallam County looks a little bit more like this. So of course, this is somewhat seasonal. And Megan and I do routinely go out and visit with folks on their properties throughout the county. And we've come to learn that chickens are really popular. Poultry is a really popular livestock and kind of overlooked. And so we were hoping by pulling together this presentation that we can help your winter poultry keeping activities be a little bit more like the previous slide and not like this current slide. So of course, when you're dealing with muddy poultry houses and muddy pens, you also have just messy birds. If you have layers and you have muddy areas, oftentimes when your hens are hopping up into their nesting boxes, they're transferring that mud and grime on their feet onto the eggs. It's just a slippery, dangerous footing for you to deal with. The poultry that are kind of that are kept in these muddy pens and houses, they often have lower body temperatures, which makes them more susceptible to disease and infection and some foot diseases. And then runoff from these muddy, manure-filled poultry pens can cause problems for wells, nearby wells, and for surface and groundwater. So it's pretty important to try to improve these areas, not only for the health of your bird, but also for the health of water and wells in your area. So this evening, we're just going to talk a bit more about some tips on keeping poultry during the winter. I'm going to talk more about coops and houses and the importance of ventilation. We're going to talk a bit about nesting boxes for those of you that have layers. Power, so we get a lot of questions about lights and heat lamps and water heaters. And there's some basic poultry keeping things like food and water, perching, bedding. We're going to talk a bit in more detail about outdoor yards and manure and litter management. So what we've learned throughout our time working in this county is that there's really a variety of techniques and kind of approaches to keeping poultry. And so what we found is that poultry are very adaptable. They can kind of thrive and live in a variety of different keeping styles and farm setups. But usually folks either have a permanent situation where you have a poultry house or a shed with an attached pen, or some sort of portable structure, like a chicken tractor tend to be popular. Some folks are just simply keeping a free range flock. And then a lot of times it's a combination of the above three types of poultry keeping styles. So I just want to briefly run through these and how they relate to winter management. So the more traditional permanent setup where you have a house, a designated house, this provides safe, secure housing. Once you've got the structure in, it's typically minimal labor to keep it going. It's a little bit easier for folks to step in and take care of poultry setups like this. And the big thing that I'm going to talk a bit more about tonight is those sorts of permanent houses are a lot easier for you to winterize. Of course, there's some considerable cost in getting these poultry houses established. It does require routine maintenance of the outdoor pen, which we'll talk more about, to reduce mud. And it doesn't give the poultry a lot of fresh ground and fresh insects. Sometimes they get a little mopey, especially if they're used to free ranging around when they're locked in this sort of setup. So these are just a few examples of what a more permanent structure looks like. So you've got your house and it's secure, you've got an attached pen or run. And for the most part around here, it's necessary to cover that run to help with hawk and eagle predation, and also to keep birds from flying out. So these are just a couple different examples. We've seen all sorts of permanent structures where someone's, salvaged an old woodshed on their property, or an old trailer. So there's a variety of options. So the next thing I want to briefly mention is portable poultry keeping, and these tend to be pretty affordable. The nice thing about this setup is you can move it around your farm and your property, which will help kind of reduce the bare mud spots that chickens love to create. And it does provide more fresh grass and vegetation and insects for the chickens. Again, there is a cost for developing these sorts of structures. It does require routine maintenance, and it does not, it's a little hard to get food and water. And the main thing is it's harder to winterize this sort of setup. It can be done, but it is a bit more challenging. And so then a lot of folks kind of adapt to this combination of a permanent and portable setup. And so this provides both predator and weather protection, and the fresh grass and insects that the poultry tend to like. But it does, again, require moving things around and requiring maintenance on two separate structures. So here's just a couple examples of some more portable setups here. We find that these work better for the spring and summer and fall months when the weather isn't quite as severe and the days are longer. So going out and moving these things around seem a little bit easier to do. Some of these, like the bottom left-hand picture with that cute cabinet, turquoise cabinet door, those, do provide a more winterized house that could be used. So that could be a permanent setup. It's pretty small, and managing that outdoor pen can be challenging too, just to try to get bedding in there if you're not moving it on a regular basis. These are more portable structures. I've seen folks are so creative coming up with ideas to move these portable structures around their property. So it could be an old pop-up trailer, an old horse trailer that can be moved around. The challenge is the pen, and I really liked that flatbed example because everything goes. The pen goes, the shed goes. You would need a tractor or a pickup truck or something along those lines to move it, but that does seem to be a pretty clever setup if you really don't have a more permanent designated poultry house and pen. But regardless of what you pick, whether it's a permanent house or a trailer, it's really important that you have proper ventilation. So poultry produce water vapor and ammonia and heat continuously. So coops need to be well ventilated all the time, day and night, throughout the winter. So a general rule of thumb is about 1 square foot of ventilation per 10 square feet of coop floor space. In cold climates, you should make sure that the vents are well above the chicken's head, so higher is better, and also make sure that you have some protection where the snow is not going to block the ventilation. The more I read up on this, I knew ventilation was a key thing, but I didn't really realize the impact of poor ventilation on poultry health until I started preparing for this webinar this evening. So definitely make sure that whatever you're using for your house, that you can get some fresh air moving through there. It seems a little counterintuitive to us that want to make sure our poultry aren't cold, but it turns out that they're pretty good about staying warm, and they will thrive in a cold environment. But where they start to have a lot of problems is if you don't have good ventilation when they're confined in these houses. So the next thing I want to mention are nesting boxes. So for those of you that have layers, and layers tend to be probably the more predominant type of poultry that folks keep in Clallam County. Obviously, if you've ever had farm fresh eggs, you know why they're such a delight when compared to store eggs. So there's some things that you can do to just try to make this part of chicken keeping a bit easier. With your nesting boxes, you want to bed with hay, straw, or some sort of wood shavings or wood chips. You should avoid like sawdust, that very fine kind of dusty material, because that can cause some respiration problems in hens. These nesting boxes, you want to routinely clean these areas. Chicken can carry lice, and like I mentioned, the hens like to get down and peck around, and they're going to get dirty and then jump up in these nesting boxes and transfer that dirt and manure with them. So it's good to try to keep the boxes as clean as possible. Your nesting boxes should be elevated off the ground, and you need to provide some sort of access ramp or a perch or some way for the hens to easily access the nesting boxes. I've seen some really cool, creative ways of making very inexpensive nesting boxes by using old drawers, an old desk. I found that one picture of some old buckets that seem to work really well. The main thing is just try to make it easy for the birds to get in and out, and also easy for you to be able to routinely clean out these boxes. So I want to talk a bit about light, which if you're keeping laying birds, they need about 12 hours of daylight to continue laying throughout the winter. So some people go ahead and decide that they don't want to deal with artificial light on their layers, and so they just realize that you're going to have a reduction, or even they might quit laying eggs altogether for a while. But if you want to keep those birds laying throughout the winter months, you need to get a system in to provide at least 12 hours of daylight. You can use, a variety of bulb types, but you know, you want to be aware that this is a dusty environment, and, you know, try to set up a system where it's easy for you to regulate with a dimmer switch and with a timer. So if you're using a fluorescent bulb, it's important to use a warm wavelength bulb. And it appears more yellow and orangish or reddish in color. And that kind of stimulates the chicken's reproductive cycle. So that's going to keep them laying more. The low wattage light bulbs, like usually a 24 to 40 watt bulb, is plenty for providing the light necessary for the hen, to encourage the hens to continue to lay. You can also use LED lights. The glassless design is kind of ideal if you end up having a situation where you break a light bulb. So if you do opt to add artificial light for the purpose of stimulating laying production throughout the winter, you want to slowly increase the supplemental lighting. We're getting ready to our days are definitely getting shorter right now. So this would be the time to get one of these systems, get a timer that will help you control the lights. Ideally, you want to add the extra lighting in the early mornings. And so rather than adding the light to the end of the day, the hens seem to do better with an early morning artificial light. You want to be very careful that you make sure that the bulbs and the cords are elevated off the ground and protected from the birds, and that you're not getting an accumulation of straw or hay or shavings kind of in the area, because that can be a fire danger for sure. So there's a lot of, I just included a few pictures. If you go to any kind of home improvement store or any farm and garden store, there's a lot of different timers and light styles out there. Some are fairly inexpensive, and you can certainly go up from there as far as timing and control. So yeah, it's a cool way to keep hens laying during the winter. Plus, it does make going out and doing your chores a little bit easier if you're not having to go out and do it in the pitch blackness that we often get in the winter months here. Another thing we get a lot of questions about is heat, and should I be heating my poultry house? For the most part, like I mentioned earlier, birds are pretty resilient. They obviously have feathers, which helps keep them warm. And the main thing is not necessarily so much heating them, but keeping them dry and kind of out of snow and drafts. And so if you have a secure poultry house, with a good roof, so you're not getting a lot of leaks or anything like that, then it's probably not necessary to add heat for adult birds. Now, if you have young birds or obviously chicks, they're certainly going to need some sort of heat lamp during the winter months. So if you do opt for adding a heating device, you need to be very careful that you have everything protected, that you're using an appropriate bulb, not just a light, but an actual heat bulb. And they should be installed so that the devices and wires leading to them are protected from contact with the poultry. I have at least one friend who had a small barn fire that originated from a poorly placed heat lamp. And I have a couple of friends that are firefighters that say they routinely deal with outbuildings and fires that are a result of heat lamps that are not properly installed. So it is a considerable danger. If you keep birds, you know that they are curious creatures and they like to fly around and bump into things. So you really need to put a lot of thought into making sure that whatever system, if you do decide to proceed with a heat lamp, that it is safe and not going to cause a potential fire. So another thing that our birds need are roosts. And this is pretty important, especially in the winter time, because they naturally want to roost up and sleep off the ground. If the ground is cold, they can get frostbite on their feet. So they need to be able to properly roost. It should be, 1.5 to 3 feet high. They really tend to prefer a multi-leveled approach. So in the photo here, there's just some examples of just sticks or large diameter sticks that were collected kind of out in the woods that have been installed to provide a variety of roosting heights. But the thing to keep in mind is that each bird needs about 8 to 10 inches of horizontal space on the perch. So make sure that you have enough perch length to accommodate all of your birds. There's a hierarchy within poultry, and usually the newer birds added to the flock tend to be kind of lower in the social status, and those will be the first to get kind of kicked off a perch that's crowded. So you just want to make sure that your birds all have an area that they can get up off of the ground in the evenings and sleep. Where you place the perch is pretty critical. You're going to have the largest accumulation of manure under the perches. So of course, don't put the perches above your nesting boxes or your feeding areas. I would put a perch and install it in such a way that it's pretty easy to get a rake or a manure fork under the perch and to clean that area. Wood is really the best. Kind of avoid using metal, which can get really cold and cause frostbite, or plastic, which can kind of degrade over time and cause some problems for their feet. So really, wood is your best material for constructing a perch. So providing feed for your poultry, you're going to need to feed more during the winter months, just like with about any type of livestock. They're spending more calories to try to keep warm, so you're going to have to increase their feed amount. Most folks that I know offer a free choice feed for their poultry, which tends to work really well, but just make sure that whatever you're feeding, it's designed for your poultry type. So what you would be feeding your laying hens is likely a different mix than what you'd be feeding your meat birds or your turkeys. So kind of think about that. The best option is to put complete feed in some sort of poultry feeder. And here's a couple examples of poultry feeders that are available, again, through online or through any of the local farm and garden stores. You need to provide scratch and grit just to aid with digestion, and they tend to like to have that actually on the ground so they can scratch around and keep themselves busy. But do take into consideration that chicken feed, especially laying hens, tend to attract rodents. So be aware of that. The less feed spillage you have, the less likely you're going to have a rodent problem. But a lot of hen houses do routinely have problems with rats and rodents, so just kind of be aware of that. Definitely excess feed needs to be, or your extra feed needs to be stored in a metal container with a lid to help discourage rodents, and try to rodent proof your houses and your pens as best as possible. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit more about is water. So poultry cannot hydrate from ice or snow. They have to have liquid water available. So it's critically important that you have water available pretty much all the time for your birds. This can be challenging when we get those really cold snaps where we've got, a few weeks of temperatures that are well below freezing. So there's some options out there for heated things, like a heated dog bowl. I've used a heated pet bowl in my hen house before, and it works really well. The one thing, of course, the hens, just being the hens, they wanted to mess with the cord a little bit. So I actually just found an old piece of hose, and I ran the cord through the hose. That way they couldn't come directly in contact with the actual cord. I've used the red Poultry-Fowl. That's what I normally water my chickens out of, and it is fabulous. They learn how to use it very easily. It's very easy to clean. However, you can buy heated ones, which that's the one challenge. The one I had wasn't heated, so it was a little bit hard to keep their water liquid and available. But you can try. I've had folks say that they've had luck with putting ping pong balls in like chicken troughs to help keep the ice from forming, but probably in those really cold temperatures, you're going to need to look at doing some sort of heated water for your poultry. So the next thing I want to talk a bit about are the litter and the bedding. And so the litter is just the material that's typically on the ground in the hen house. And so This is kind of where diligence and routine management really comes into play during the winter months. So what I usually recommend is that folks use what's called a deep litter or a deep bedding method. There is a lot of information out on the internet about how to do this. But basically, you're going to start with at least 6 inches of some sort of dry material. I personally like straw because it's readily available. It's easy to transport. You can buy it at any of the feed stores. Throw a bale in the bed of your truck and have it right there near your hen house. But you're going to want to spread out the straw, fluff it up about 6 inches to start with, and then you're going to need to routinely go in there with a pitchfork or a hay fork and kind of fluff that top area. You'll see over time the hens will kind of smash down the bedding, and there'll be a lot of manure deposited on top. But if you routinely go in there and kind of fluff that, what it'll do is it'll drop the manure down towards the bottom of the floor and then leave dry material on the top. So you're going to need to periodically add more straw or whatever you pick as a substrate on the bottom to kind of keep that 6 inches and to keep the hens up above that kind of dirty layer that's underneath. And then in the spring, or it may need to be done more frequently depending on how big your shed is and how many birds you have in there, but you'll want to completely clean out the area. We'll talk a little bit more about what to do with that material you clean out of there, but this deep bedding method is just a way of kind of dropping the wet soiled bedding and manure to the bottom of the hen house while providing a dry, fluffy top layer for them to hang out in during the winter months. So the benefits of using this sort of method is that it does, if you do it right, it's not something that's smelly or stinky. It reduces a lot of flies. It makes the coop a much more attractive area. It keeps your birds clean, so their feet are clean and your eggs tend to be cleaner. It gives them something to do. You'll see they'll be in there scratching around and throwing that bedding around, but it keeps them happy and busy. And it saves you work because you're not in there every couple days completely stripping out an area and adding new bedding. Where things go wrong with this method, like I mentioned, is it does require consistent management. So you really do need to do your best to try to keep things dry. So if you've got a leaky roof, get in there right away and fix that leaky roof, because if this area gets wet, it does get stinky, kind of things go anaerobic, and your hens are not going to be as happy. So dry is key, and then kind of constantly fluffing it and adding that fresh bedding is also key. So we're kind of moving into I'm going to take a break here now and kind of switch things back over to Megan, because we're going to move into the part of the presentation where we're going to talk about outdoor pens and kind of what you can do to make those easier to deal with in the winter. But I want to turn it back over to Megan in case we've had questions that have come up during the presentation so far. So Megan, I'm going to unmute you and go for it.
All right. Yeah, so far we don't have any questions. You've been doing a fantastic job, I think, covering everything, Jen. So unless anybody quick wants to type anything into the, will this presentation be sent to us afterwards? Yes, we're recording this presentation, and we should be able to compile it and have a link to a YouTube video sent to you by probably tomorrow morning. And we do have a question, Jen, about the difference between pelleted feed versus loose grain.
Yeah, so the pelleted feed, so there's feed that's formulated specifically for poultry management, especially for layers and broilers, and it has kind of the trace minerals and nutrients that are required to either produce eggs or produce heavy chicken breasts or whatever it is you're trying to grow. Whereas a lot of times you can find inexpensive, like an all stock or just a grain product, which, chickens, if you keep chickens, they'll eat just about anything. And so, they can be fed something like that. But the pelleted formulated feed is specifically designed to kind of maximize whatever production you're trying to do. So if you're not real worried about increasing egg yields and stuff, then you might be able to get away with feeding just a loose grain. But that may result in your birds not having exactly all the nutrients and minerals they need to kind of be at their best. Does that answer the question?
That sounded like a great answer to me. Yep, and it looks like that did answer that question for that person.
Okay.
We did have a question about sand flooring for coops.
Yeah, so sand is an option, and I did say I was going to talk more about different types of like litter in a house. I don't like sand for the base inside a hen house. I mean, it can be used, but you know, I like some sort of very permanent firm base on the bottom that can be easily cleaned. With the sand, you end up kind of cleaning out a lot of the sand. For the outdoor yards, I'll talk about sand. Sand is an option to use, and it does work well for some operations. If you have better drain soil and you don't tend to get like your ground doesn't hold a lot of water, doesn't get soupy, then sand might be a great option. In the hen houses, it seems like the base of that is a lot of times it's either a concrete pad or it's a packed gravel base. A lot of times people have their hen houses on like a raised wooden floor, but you just want something that you can, you know, the couple times a year where you completely strip that house out and give it a good scrub. You just want some sort of, you know, layer that can be easily cleaned, and sand can be a little hard inside to do that.
All right, we have a question regarding humidity, if that needs to be managed inside of a coop.
Yeah, yes. Like I mentioned at the beginning, poultry are amazingly resilient, and so they can live in a variety of humidity conditions. I think if you end up with your humidity too high and this is especially a problem if you're adding a lot of heat and you're just getting condensation and dripping, like if you don't have it insulated well, that can be a problem because like I mentioned earlier, your goal with managing poultry during the winter is to keep them dry. So you know, if you get the humidity too high, that can be a problem. In our climate, I'm not worried about them like not having enough humidity. You know, people keep chickens from Florida successfully all the way up to Alaska and in the Midwest where they get, you know, minus 20-degree weather. And so I think they can adapt to a variety of things. So the goal with the humidity, I would say, is just to keep them from becoming wet.
All right, we have a question now regarding deep litter with ducks, geese, and waterfowl. If there's a way to manage those wetter conditions utilizing deep litter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have one slide later in the presentation on waterfowl. These guys are just a bit more challenging, right? Because they love water. And so it's really critical that they have access to water all the time because they need drinking water in order to properly eat and digest their food. In that situation, you can do deep litter method in houses. And I would say it would be a very similar management to what I just described in the poultry. The challenge is you're going to need to separate out their watering and probably feeding stations with the house. And so my recommendation would be, you know, they still need a secure dry house, but then I would, you know, set up some sort of system directly adjacent to the house where they have their water pans and their feed pans. I think honestly, and I have not kept waterfowl in a really long time, but if it were me, I would invest in a stall mat or something along those lines to kind of use as a base in the outside area and put their feed pan and water pan outside. And then keep it out of the house, because I think just knowing what a mess they make and how they love to splash and just make a big mess, I would, you know, be inclined to say have that mess be outside on some sort of impervious dry surface or a surface you can easily clean, and then try the deep bedding method in the house. And I think especially the ducks, the geese might be a little bit more challenging because they're so heavy, but I think it would work really well. You just will likely need a lot more material, more straw, more hay than you would for a poultry setup.
Thank you, Jen. A question regarding alder sawdust, and that was from the same person that asked about the deep litter management for waterfowl, so maybe it might be along those same lines.
Yeah, I don't specifically know about alder sawdust. I don't think there's any trouble with alder. The disadvantage of sawdust is it's very fine, and it it can cause some respiration problems if they're really like blowing it all around and stuff, and there's like sawdust coating everything. I tend to like shavings better, like a heavier wood product. And the challenge with sawdust too is that it will absorb water, but just a small amount of water. So if you have sawdust outside, for example, like in an outdoor yard, I think that is only gonna work for a couple days before it becomes a soupy, soggy mess. It just doesn't have the structure to really hold up to a lot of wetness. So I think it has its applications, but you would have to use a lot of sawdust, and it would have to kind of pack down in order for it to really work in the long term to keep things from becoming really muddy.
All right, and we have one last question regarding free-ranging birds. Now that the leaves, are off of the bushes that they're hiding in during the summertime, should there be a lot of concern about whether the hawks might try to come and grab them?
Yeah, so the challenge with free range, and I have done this all, is that they are way more susceptible to predation during the winter months. And there's a couple different factors that come into that, but it is their hiding spots are obviously much more open, so they're easier to see. Things start to get hungry, food's not as plentiful during the winter, so you may not have seen a coyote on your place until about end of December, and she's hungry and she shows up and picks off, one hen every day. So yeah, I mean, birds do successfully free range. I think you're better off trying to encourage them or give them a actual structure to go in rather than just hoping they kind of persevere out in the bushes and the trees. So I mean, you can do that. You can encourage them to come in. I mean, roosting is kind of their big thing, and so I would say, find a more secure spot, put up a roost for them, move their food and water kind of into that area, and see if you can get them to come in, because the smart ones might make it through, the lucky ones, but there's a good chance that they will get picked off by predators, especially eagles, hawks, coyotes during the winter months.
Great, thank you. And I may not have specified well on that, that it's mainly whether they should limit roaming when the leaves are off the bushes. And so I think you covered that at the beginning part. So I apologize.
Yeah.
I mentioned the roaming part. So that is the end of the questions for this particular section. Feel free to keep asking the questions as we go along, everyone. And then at the end, we'll have another chance to pause and answer all your questions as well.
Great. Thanks, Megan. So I'm going to move into the outdoor yards now. And so Megan and I routinely help horse and livestock owners with muddy pens. Just the nature of the climate we live in, we get a large amount of rain in a very short time period. A lot of our soils, especially if you're up in the foothills, are just naturally poorly drained soils. There's a glaciated till layer down. So mud and standing water is a common occurrence throughout the county. So if you are really wanting to tackle creating a permanent outdoor poultry yard that is mud free, then I'd suggest you follow the steps here on this slide. So, first thing, make sure you don't have any surface water coming into the area. Ideally, you want about a 2% slope. You can have one that's a little bit greater, but you want to slope the area so you're shedding water away from your coop or your hen house. If you're in a very poorly drained area, it's not a bad idea to install geotextile fabric on the base. And so this is road building cloth. It's heavy duty. It's what they use underneath logging roads. And you're going to put gravel footing on top of that. And so we recommend using a perimeter. You can use old railroad ties or even old fence posts, but basically you're going to make a sandbox, which you're then going to backfill with some sort of footing. We typically recommend 5/8 minus, so this is crushed gravel. that you would kind of fill in that sandbox area. And what that does is that basically raises the whole elevation of your birds above the natural ground layer. It gives water a chance to run off and then hopefully keep mud and down while keeping your chickens up. So because poultry, and I'll talk a little bit more about just their unique nature of their manure, but it is very high in nutrients and bacteria. And so there is going to be runoff that comes off of this mud-free pen during the winter months. We're going to get rain. That rain has to go somewhere. And when it washes off of your poultry yard, it washes all the nutrients and the bacteria as well. So it's pretty important that you leave a very grassy filter strip kind of on all sides of your chicken pen, especially the down slope side. I strongly recommend you to locate your poultry pens at least 200 feet away from your own groundwater. As I mentioned, chicken poultry manure is very high in nitrogen. And so if you're on especially very well-drained soils and you have a lot of poultry manure, the nitrates can run off down into your well water. So try to put these pens as far away from your well as possible. And also do not locate them near a stream or a ditch or a pond, because again, the same concern with runoff coming off of these areas. Try to direct all that runoff into a grassy filter strip area. So let's see here. Okay. So again, so you're wanting to divert surface water away. The next time it rains really hard, which probably won't be in too much time, take a walk around your chicken area, see where the water's coming from and what you can do to try to intercept that water and keep it away from your house and your yard. It's really hard for Megan and I to give recommendations about drainage kind of in one of these webinars. It's very site specific, but you know, do take a look at your topography, kind of the natural drainage of where this goes. You know, in our county, you need to keep your drainage water on your own property. So just kind of running it onto the neighbor's property is not an ideal scenario. So if you need help with drainage systems, you know, you can chat with us more. We can kind of give you some recommendations. But the key is just to keep clean water out of this area. An easy way to deal with that is making sure you have a good roof runoff system on your poultry or hen house. So strongly recommend you install gutters and downspouts on your building. Even if you have it set up where it's a shed style roof and that roof water is draining kind of on the opposite side of the poultry pen, what will happen is when we get those big rain events, a lot of times that roof water will still somehow make it into the house or make it into the pen. So the best thing to do is just put a gutter and a downspout on that building and then outlet that downspout either into a dry well or somewhere where it's not going to cause a problem for your poultry or any other livestock that you might have. Basically, you want to keep clean roof water out of these poultry yards, which are not clean. And you know, it's even a small shed can generate a lot of water. So 1,000 square foot roof, if you have 1 inch of rain on that, that's 625 gallons. So now figure out what the rainfall is in your area, and that's a lot of water that's coming off of a roof. So again, talking about these permanent pens, if we're going to assume that you have a mucky, poorly drained site, here's kind of just a quick diagram of what I talked about in the first slide, the native soil material, a layer of geotextile fabric, and then 6 inches of 5/8- packed gravel. So this is kind of your Cadillac system if you really want to get your chickens up above the native ground and keep them out of the mud. So then a couple different things. If it's really not that bad and you just have maybe a little skiff of mud on the top that makes the birds dirty and the eggs dirty, then you can look at some other sorts of footing that you can use to kind of cover up the bare ground. Anytime you have bare ground, and if you have chickens or any sort of poultry confined in an area, you will most certainly have bare ground in a matter of days, actually. But you're going to want to cover that bare ground. Bare ground is where you start having the mud problems. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you can use wood. I like the hog fuel, the large diameter chipped wood. I mentioned I'm not a big fan of sawdust. I don't think it just doesn't have the structure to hold up in our sort of climate. It might work well in more drier climates, but I just don't think it works well outdoor in our climate. Sand can be used. Shavings Again, I like the larger diameter. You can use things like straw. If you have old hay or old straw, and you go out there and kind of layer it up, but this is more than just like an inch or two. You want to put like several inches, half a foot of straw or old hay down. That will help. Your goal is basically to cover up the bare ground and get those birds up above the native soil. So I'm just going to quickly run through kind of the pros and cons of these different footing options. So again, I like the chips or the hog fuel. I think that it binds up the nitrogen well, so it's not as stinky, so it can help with odor issues. And you can compost it and use it as mulch later. Again, you need several inches of this, and it's not a real permanent solution. It will break down over time, and you will have to add more to it. So someone mentioned sand earlier, and sand does work well too. You can rake, use like a leaf rake or something to kind of rake manure up off the top, or use a manure fork to kind of try to keep the surface as clean as possible. The birds naturally like using it for dusting and during the summer, actually during the winter months too. It's a good option if your soil is well drained. So if you've just had a little skiff of mud in your poultry yards in the past, sand might work great for you. If you've got ponded water and it's really squishy, then I would encourage you to consider a gravel base. And you could top coat it with sand, but I would not use sand as your sole footing. So again, you're going to need several inches of it. You're going to need to clean it on a pretty regular basis. It doesn't do much for odor control. So if you're not good about cleaning it, it can get a bit stinky, and it tends to be a little bit more expensive than the wood products. So here's just some examples of using straw or hay. Again, that's inexpensive. It's easy to spread. It does help kind of bind up the nitrogen smell. The thing I do like about straw and hay versus like wood chips or hog fuel is it does compost much quicker. The carbon content's much smaller, so it breaks down a lot quicker. If you're using like the wood chips or the hog fuel, when you get to the point that it's so soiled, you need to clean it out. It's going to take some pretty active management to get that to compost down into a more usable product, unless you just plan on using it as mulch somewhere on your property. The drawbacks to using straw or hay is, again, if you have a naturally wet spot, it doesn't really do much for you. It can get pretty soggy, and this is something that you need to frequently add out in your pen. So it's not just like a once a month sort of thing. It's like a weekly or sometimes even daily sort of bedding. So we see a lot of portable poultry yards, which are awesome. Birds love it because it gives them access to fresh greens. It's nice because it can help reduce the odor. It's just not very practical during the winter months. If you've ever moved this poultry netting, it's not as easy as one would think. And it doesn't hold up well to snow, drifting snow, or wind. And it can be a challenge to keep it electrified. And, there are some predation concerns too. Obviously, hawks can easily come in and out of these areas. But it is an option, I'd say more of an option during the nicer weather than it is during winter time. Okay, so I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about some other poultry types, and so I want to just talk a bit about turkeys. I've kept turkeys before. I love keeping turkeys. I think they're great. Some people don't agree, but the one thing to know is that you should not keep turkeys and chickens together. They need to be separated. There's a disease that can pass between the birds that can be pretty problematic. That being said, there's lots of stories out there, and I read into lots of people who successfully keep them together without a problem, but the general recommendation is not to keep them together. Most turkey breeds can handle cold weather once they reach maturity. I think the heritage breeds tend to do better than the more commercial breeds, and that's kind of not just for winter keeping. The heritage breeds just tend to be a little easier and more adaptable than the commercial breeds. It's pretty important that you provide a roost for the birds, and those roosts need to be large enough that they can get their feet completely covered. So because turkey are larger birds, they need like a 4-inch, width to stand on. And so the 2x4s tend to be the easiest thing to create their perches. And that just provides them with enough space to ensure that they can cover their feet. Their feet are pretty prone to frostbite. And a simple thing, and you could probably do this actually with chickens too, but adding corn to their diet can help them, it just increases their calories and helps them keep a bit warmer during the cold nights. So waterfowl, I briefly mentioned waterfowl earlier during the question and answer section, but again, they need a secure predator-proof house or coop. And again, it needs to be well ventilated, and this is the same for turkeys as well. Because the waterfowl don't roost at night like the chickens and turkeys do, they need extra bedding in their house. Straw really works well. You can use sawdust inside too, but they will have frostbite on their feet if they don't have a warm surface that they can stand on. So it's pretty important to keep their houses well bedded. As I mentioned earlier, they absolutely have to have thawed water at all time because of how they digest food. So it's pretty critical that you ensure you come up with a system to ensure that they have water, whether you use a heated pan. It is challenging. It's kind of like keeping pigs. They like to play in water too, and waterfowl are no exception. So weighting down a bowl or a trough to help keep them from, flipping it over and turning it over. Again, I would strongly recommend you provide feed and water outside of the house, or you're going to be constantly stripping out wet bedding all the time. And again, some sort of stall mat or a gravel pad or something to put the water and food on, I think will really help out. I also want to mention that they don't like this idea, but they don't actually need swimming water during the winter months. It just gets really challenging trying to manage their kind of swimming areas. So although they might be disappointed, it's not necessary for them to have a pool or a pond to swim in during the winter months. The other thing I'll mention too on waterfowl is that domestic waterfowl, so domestic ducks and geese, can really impact water quality of natural ponds and streams. We've done a lot of water quality studies, and we have found that folks that keep like large flocks of not even large flocks, even small flocks of domestic ducks and geese in natural streams and ponds with outlets, that can significantly cause problems with water quality. So I would encourage you, if you want to keep ducks, they're so friendly, amazing. Same with geese. I would encourage you to not let them have access to natural water features on your property. Instead, give them the kiddie pool or something else, a trough or something to play in. So lastly, I want to talk a bit more about manure. If you've kept chickens, you realize right away they eat more than you think they should eat, and they create a lot more manure than you think that is possible for something that size. So one chicken's producing about 1/3 pound of manure every day. That's 8 to 11 pounds per month per bird. So that high volume of that is moisture. So about 80% of it is moisture. So it does dry out to be a smaller amount. But as I mentioned earlier, that manure is really high in nitrogen and phosphorus. And the manure oftentimes does contain when we're cleaning out the houses and stuff, it does have the dry carbon material and bedding from the litter. So you hear people say chicken manure, poultry manure is hot, and this is what you're talking about. So if you're looking at the pounds of nutrient in like a ton of chicken manure compared to a ton of beef manure, you can see that N there, which is nitrogen, is incredibly high. It's 27.3 pounds of nitrogen per ton. And same with if you slide over to P2O5, that's the phosphate. So that's, again, a very high level. So this is kind of just wanted to show this so you understand when people are talking about manure, chicken manure being hot, or this is what they're talking about. It's high in these nutrients. Great thing for increasing soil fertility. You have to be really careful with how you use it. And that is why I kind of have a couple slides on how to manage the poultry manure and the litter. So if you're cleaning the houses, I especially recommend cleaning the nest boxes on a regular basis. You're going to want to have a pile somewhere. Maybe you have a compost bin or a manure storage structure, but at a minimum, you're going to want to pile this material up during the winter, and you're going to want to cover it with a tarp. The tarp keeps the rainwater from mixing with the manure and the bedding and running off. Remember I mentioned that that runoff can leach down into groundwater and cause problems. Plus, there's good nutrients in that manure that might be valuable for you to help improve your pastures or help improve your gardens. So you want to keep that manure pile tarped. You want to make sure, just like with your poultry pens, that you have a vegetated filter strip around the manure pile. Make sure there's not water near or running through the manure pile. And especially with poultry manure, because it is so high in nutrients, it's not a bad idea if you have a concrete area where you can store it on a concrete slab. That is really ideal. So we do recommend that you compost poultry manure and litter before using it, and that kind of helps stabilize things. And so because and I'll talk a little bit more about composting, but you're going to definitely want to add some carbon material to the manure. Ideally, you already have it there because you're cleaning out your straw bedded poultry house. But you need to ensure the composting process is complete before you use this material on your gardens, especially if you're feeding a high protein diet like a meat diet. That will even increase the amount of nitrogen in the chicken manure more than if it's a vegetarian diet. So I'm just going to run through composting very quickly. We have a lot more information on our website. WSU Extension can provide you with a lot more information on composting. But basically, you have these microorganisms that are working to break down the organic components of manure and bedding. And these little critters are not unlike the critters you keep, like chickens or livestock. They need oxygen. So that's coming into turning the pile. You can put PVC pipes in and help encourage airflow. Those little critters need moisture. They need water, just like your chickens. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, the chicken manure is already very wet, so you might not need to add moisture, but your compost pile should be about as wet as a wrung out sponge. You need dry material. So again, you have to kind of mess around with the combination, but you're going to need to use more straw or carbon material with composting chicken manure than you would, like, say, with horse manure. The nitrogen's the green manure, so that's the poultry waste. And then you're going to need heat for this process to happen. Again, keeping the pile covered with a tarp will help generate heat. And then the time it's going to take is really going to vary, 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer. So when you have finished compost, it's a more stable product to use, and it reduces the volume quite a bit. So slow release fertilizer, excellent soil amendment. Here's just a couple examples of different composting structures. You can get creative out there with how you kind of develop these composting areas, but it is good to designate an area. And so that finally brings us to the last slide. Megan and I routinely make farm visits, so we're available to come out and help you with any challenges that you might be having on your farm. And all of our services are free of charge. We offer a low-cost soil testing service. We do an annual native plant sale that is pretty popular. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Megan in case we have any questions that I didn't get to. And that final picture, that's a picture of my daughter in her costume contest a few years ago at fair with her rooster Steve. So with that, Megan, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you for questions.
All right, we do have a couple in here so far. Someone has some plastic soft drink crates that their hens use for laying boxes, and the edge is fairly narrow, and they're wondering if they should worry about frostbite this winter and possibly make new boxes that have wider wood sides.
Are they roosting on so for the nesting boxes, I wouldn't worry about it.
Oh, I apologize. Yeah, they do roost on them. I'm sorry. Yes, they roost on the edge of those laying boxes. Yes.
Yeah. You know, I had some hens that did a similar sort of thing, and you actually want to try to discourage them from nesting on those boxes because, as I mentioned, you end up with a lot of manure accumulation there. So I would try to develop like a wooden perch kind of away from the nesting boxes and see if you can get them to nest on wooden perches rather than the edge of the plastic edge of the nesting box, because that could be frostbite concerns, and then also just I think an accumulation of manure near the nesting box is less than ideal.
All right, thank you. And let's see, another question. I'm going to just read this one outright.
Okay.
Our permanent coop is 12 by 15 with an attached fully fenced 1,600 square foot chicken run. And they're planning on bringing in 12 hens and running them in 800 square foot paddocks. Is there anything they should keep in mind in regard to keeping mud at bay in that chicken run? And also, is there a certain amount of outdoor space per chicken that can be used to calculate sort of a best case scenario to avoid mud?
Yeah, the obviously the larger the area, the less impact you're going to have. But what I know about poultry is that it's amazing how quickly they can devegetate an area. And the way our grass and kind of vegetation works around here is we do have a long growing season. So a lot of the year you can get away with just kind of having them in a big pen, and there's still grass and kind of plants growing in the area. But what happens is those plants about this time of year go dormant as the days get shorter and the temperature decreases. That grass will quit growing. That's why you don't usually have to mow your lawn in January. And the hens will kind of decimate that entire area. So I would say that you're probably still going to need to add some sort of footing to the outdoor yard. A lot of it's soil dependent. So if you have pretty well drained soils, it may not be an issue. But my hunch is that you're still going to want to add some straw or some wood chips or something to that area, because I do think that especially if we have the sort of winter they're predicting with a lot of rainfall, it's not going to take those hens much time to strip all the vegetation out of there once the grass quits growing. And then when you have the bare ground and then you add in the significant amount of rainfall that we get in months like January and February, you will undoubtedly have mud. Hopefully I'm wrong. Maybe just see what happens, kind of watch and wait thing. But I think I'd have a pile of wood chips ready to go for when things do get messy.
All right, so we have a question regarding transitioning hens back and forth between Clallam County and Idaho. Someone moves back and forth. And is there a suggestion for a breed of laying hen that may adjust to that move better? Any thoughts?
I don't have a good answer for that. I do know that the larger kind of domestic birds tend to be a little bit more readily adaptable than kind of some of the smaller varieties. There are I guess I would say I would be looking for a breed variety that tends to be docile and tends to be easygoing. I don't know what the WSDA restrictions are moving birds back and forth, but I would just, they can, it doesn't take much to stress them out. So I don't know if you use like dog kennels or something, but I would try to keep everything as calm as possible. Whatever you're using in Idaho, if you're bedding with straw, and maybe have a dog kennel in there so they're not terrified of it. Yeah, I don't have a really good recommendation. I don't know, Megan, do you have breeds that you find more docile and easier going than others?
I did find that my buff Orpingtons were pretty low key compared to the other ones, some of the more heritage breeds that I've had. So that, and I feel like, I'm blanking on the name, but the white ones that are pretty common. I can't think of them.
I can't, yes. I was hoping it was the one going to be a lot of breed questions, because I'm not as good with the breeds. But yeah, I do believe the Orpingtons are pretty low-key and easygoing. I've had my Rhode Island Reds they're not overly, I don't think they're as friendly as the Orpingtons, but they tend to be pretty quiet too and resilient.
Yes, I've had good luck with those as well. Okay, so another question that we have is, are there plants that can be poisonous to chickens? And that may be one that we have to have a whole separate thing on. We will be having a workshop, or maybe even a couple, this coming spring on plants that are poisonous. But are there any off the top of your head, Jen, that you just want to kind of quickly touch on?
Yeah, there certainly are plants that are poisonous. Any of the nightshades can be a problem. So look at black nightshade, hairy nightshade, hemlock, poison hemlock would certainly be a problem for poultry as well. So know what any farmer and livestock owner, including poultry owners, should know what poison hemlock looks like, and nightshade. I'm drawing a blank on other ones right away. I know that there are some things, there's a lot of information out there, and maybe I should have included a slide on like what not to feed your chickens, but there are a lot of just even like household foods that you should avoid feeding chickens. So I would say just do a quick Google search. But as Megan said, we will offer a workshop every spring on kind of identifying and controlling poisonous and noxious plants. And so that is a good thing to be aware of. That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head other plants, but the best thing to do is, you know, go out, look in your yard or your poultry yard. If there's something that you're just not really sure what it is, you can take a picture and send it to either Megan or myself or Kathy Lucero, who's the Clallam County's Noxious Weed Coordinator. And hopefully one of the three of us would be able to identify what it is and provide you with some recommendations.
And yes, I totally agree on Googling it. When you do that, there's a huge list of different things that are poisonous to them, some of which are native, like Jennifer mentioned, the nightshade, foxglove, but also a lot of the ornamentals can be poisonous to them as well. So really with any livestock, chickens included, we just suggest that if you can keep them away from a lot of those ornamentals, that is a good thing to do because many of those can be poisonous to them. So probably stay tuned. This, I think, would be a really great topic for this coming spring to touch on that at that time. So another question that we had is if it would be recommended to put a tarp or clear plastic sheeting over a portable run to keep the rain out during the fall and winter months.
I mean, I'd say give it a shot. What I know from keeping tarps like outside is that can be kind of challenging because it'll just kind of pile up. If maybe if you had a center stake or something to try to give the water somewhere to sheet off, so that could certainly help. I just think you'd have to be pretty diligent about how you tied it off and how you installed it to help water sheet off of the area, and then also have it not blow away in a windstorm.
All right. And I believe the last question is if transporting hens for a long distance would cause them to stop laying.
Yeah, it could cause them to stop laying, especially if you're going from dissimilar climates. And so if it's really cold somewhere and more mild, that could definitely be something that's happening. So yes, any sort of stressful event can kind of cause a hen to quit laying. So that is a possibility. Again, if you try to keep things as similar as possible, poultry, especially laying hens, are very social creatures. They have their girlfriends and they want to stay with their girlfriends. So I'd say trying to keep the flock together is pretty key and will help keep them happier. And the happier they are, the more likely they are to continue to lay.
Fantastic. Well, that was all the questions, and there have been a bunch of thank yous. You've done a really wonderful job on this webinar, Jennifer. And so with that, I think we're going to wrap this up. We will have this recording available. As I mentioned, it will be emailed out to everyone. If for some reason you don't see it in your email inbox tomorrow at some point in time, most likely in the morning, then please check your spam or your junk folder. Sometime it can end up in there. And we appreciate all of you for joining us. It's really wonderful. We're enjoying having these webinars. And if you have any suggestions for other topics you would like to see us cover, please feel free to email us those. We're always looking for more information that people would like to create these webinars. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.